Chen Peng always knew that life was a predictable sequence of static moments, like the hum of electricity beneath the surface of the world. As an electrical engineer at the national power grid, he understood the flow of current better than most. Every wire, every circuit, every flicker of a light bulb told a story he had learned to read and manage. He was the invisible hand that kept the lights on, the turbine spinning, and the grid from crashing into chaos. But on that rainy Thursday night, as the storm raged outside and the wind howled through the broken windows of the substation, Chen's life would change forever. The sky crackled with the kind of electric energy that made the air smell sharp and metallic. The substation, old and neglected, groaned under the pressure. And when lightning struck, a jagged, violent bolt that seemed to target the very core of the facility, Chen's world was upended. He had been troubleshooting a malfunctioning transformer when the storm hit, the fury of nature coinciding with the unsteady pulse of the grid. Before he could react, the transformer exploded with a deafening roar, throwing Chen backward. His head slammed into the concrete floor, and his body was flung into a mass of twisted wires and sparking equipment. For a moment, everything went black. When Chen regained consciousness, it was to the sound of the fire alarms blaring and the sharp, acrid smell of smoke filling his nostrils. His fingers twitched, an involuntary response as his body struggled to rise. But as he moved, something strange happened. His eyes flicked toward the shattered control panel, the flickering lights and buzzing wires, and an inexplicable sensation washed over him. It wasn't just the aftershock of the accident, it was something new. Something, alive, electricity. He could feel it. More than feel it, he could sense it in a way that was almost intimate. Every current that flowed through the wires, every pulse of energy that surged through the power grid, it was as though it was calling to him. He could hear it, the soft hum of the currents, the whispering whispers of volts and amps dancing in unison. And when his fingers brushed against the control panel, the surge of energy was like a jolt of fire coursing through him, but it wasn't painful. It was exhilarating. He pulled his hand away, unsure whether he had imagined the sensation. His body still felt numb, but his mind was wide awake, buzzing with awareness. As he stumbled to his feet, he realized something else: he could control it. The flow of electricity, the way it moved, the way it responded, it was at his command. At first, it was small. The lights flickered as he passed by, and with a simple focus, he was able to make them brighten, then dim, at will. He laughed quietly to himself. It was ridiculous. A trick. Just a side effect of the accident. That had to be it, right? But when he walked toward the door, his steps slow and unsteady, he caught sight of a vending machine by the wall. The screen had gone black, the power cut off when the system had failed earlier. Without thinking, he focused on it, and to his surprise, the screen blinked back to life, the letters and numbers scrolling across the display in perfect sequence. It wasn't just a fluke. He didn't know how or why it worked, but he knew it did. The current was no longer something abstract, it was something tangible, something he could bend to his will. The potential was limitless. For a brief moment, he wondered if he should tell someone, get help. But then, something inside him pushed those thoughts away. This was his, and only his. With a deep breath, he walked outside the substation, his mind racing. The storm had passed, but the world around him still hummed with energy. It was like he had tapped into a hidden part of reality, one that connected everything. Every wire, every power station, every device that hummed and buzzed, it was all linked, and now, so was he. In the days that followed, Chen's fascination grew. He began experimenting, small tests at first. The light switch in his apartment. A malfunctioning coffee machine. A television remote. He could make things work again with a simple thought, a subtle command. It was intoxicating. The power to control everything around him, to bend technology to his will, it was like being a magician in a world that had long since forgotten the art of wonder. But as his skills grew stronger, so did his curiosity. He started to realize that his powers weren't limited to just fixing broken machines. He could manipulate the flow of electricity, control it with precision. It wasn't just about turning things on and off, it was about control. True control. One evening, after a particularly long day at the grid, Chen sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring at his computer screen. His mind raced with the possibilities. He had been able to turn on the lights, fix his appliances, but what if he could go further? What if he could reach into the very systems that ran the world, those vast networks of information that connected everything, from power plants to government databases? It was a simple thought, an innocent curiosity. What would happen if he hacked the grid? The first time he did it, he was careful. He had been studying the architecture of the grid for years, understanding its vulnerabilities, its weak points. He knew that a skilled hacker could potentially infiltrate the system and redirect power. What he hadn't expected was the ease with which he could do it, the fluidity with which he was able to enter the system, his mind syncing with the hum of the electrical pulse. It was as if the grid itself welcomed him, folding open to reveal its secrets. He didn't take anything, not at first. He simply watched, studied, and marveled at the complexity of it all. Data flowed through the grid like an invisible river, one that carried not just electricity but information, encrypted communications, signals, coordinates. It was a strange world, hidden beneath the hum of power lines and buried deep within the circuits of the machines, but the more Chen observed, the more he understood. This world was not just a network of wires, it was a web of control. The grid, the internet, the very systems that powered society were all interconnected, feeding each other, shaping the flow of information, and ultimately, the flow of power. One night, after weeks of observation, Chen did something he hadn't planned on. He changed something. Just a small alteration, an edit to a data file, a nudge that would go unnoticed. He wasn't sure what he was trying to prove, whether it was just the thrill of manipulation or a deeper need to understand the scope of his power. But the moment he did it, the moment that change rippled through the system, he felt the weight of it. He had crossed a line. The next day, Chen woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the smooth screen. For a moment, the screen flickered, then went blank. He frowned. He had just charged it. Maybe it was a glitch. But then, without warning, the screen blinked back on, and a message appeared. "I know what you're doing." It was an encrypted message, one that hadn't come from anyone he knew. His heart raced. How could anyone know? He had been so careful, but before he could investigate further, his phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was not Chen Peng. It was a woman's voice, calm but firm. "We need to talk. What you're doing could be dangerous." Chen's mind raced as he held the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was calm, eerily so, but there was something unnerving in the way the words hung in the air. "We need to talk. What you're doing could be dangerous." He couldn't place the voice. It wasn't anyone from the power grid, not anyone he'd ever worked with. The tone, though, was one of authority, but not the kind that came from a simple government official. This was something else, something far more shadowy. His first instinct was to hang up. But he didn't. The impulse to know more, whatever it was stronger. Something told him this was no ordinary phone call. I don't know who you are," Chen stammered, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. "What do you mean, dangerous?" The voice sighed, a long, exasperated sound. "You don't understand. Do you think you're the first to stumble on these abilities? What you're playing with, Chen, it's more than just power, it's control. And there are people, powerful people, who don't like their control being threatened." Chen's heart skipped. He didn't speak. He just listened. "You've tapped into something bigger than you," the voice continued. "Something you don't understand. And now, you're on their radar." There was a pause, as if the person on the other end was weighing whether to continue. "I can help you, but you need to be careful. You can't just go around changing things. You don't know what that will set in motion." Chen's mind was swimming. The way the voice spoke, as if they had been watching him all along, set off alarms in his head. The thought that his small experiments with the grid, his innocent curiosity, hadn't gone unnoticed sent a cold shiver down his spine. "You're not alone in this," the voice said. "There are others like you, others who can control the flow of electricity, bend it to their will. But they're not your friends, Chen. Some of them work for the government. Some want to use that power for themselves." Before Chen could respond, the voice dropped a final piece of information. "You've already made a mistake, but you can still make it right. If you don't, they'll come for you. They'll take everything from you." The line went dead. Chen's fingers tightened around the phone, his knuckles white. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he felt something else now, something far stronger than before. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the power he had so freely manipulated. Now knowing that he wasn't the only one who could control it, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The accident, the power, the way everything had shifted, this was bigger than just a malfunctioning grid. This was a game of power, a game he hadn't been prepared to play. For hours, he sat in his apartment, staring at the phone, unable to move, unable to think clearly. His mind was a storm of confusion, the words from the mysterious caller echoing through his thoughts. "They'll come for you." He had to make a decision. But what? What was he supposed to do with this newfound power? The question gnawed at him. At first, it had seemed harmless, just a strange side effect of the accident, something he could use to fix broken machines, to have a bit of fun with. But now, everything had changed. There were people watching, people who knew what he could do. And they wanted something from him. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller's ID was private this time, Chen. The voice on the other end was the same, but there was an edge to it now, a sense of urgency. "You're still there?" Chen didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say. Instead, he let out a shaky breath and finally asked, "Who are you?" "Someone who's trying to help you." The voice softened, as if understanding the tension in his silence. "You don't understand what's at stake. There are people in positions of power, people who want to use what you can do to reshape the world. And if they succeed, well, the future won't be yours to shape anymore." Chen could feel the gravity of the situation weighing down on him, every word from the voice sinking in like a stone into the still waters of his thoughts. His initial impulse was to shut it all out. To tell the voice to leave him alone. But he couldn't. The feeling, the knowing, that there were forces out there far more powerful than he could ever imagine, lurking in the shadows, made it impossible to turn away. "What do you want from me?" Chen asked, his voice hoarse, unsure of whether he was speaking to a friend or an enemy. "I want to help you see things clearly," the voice replied. "I want you to see the truth. There's a war happening, Chen. A war you're a part of now. One that's fought in the currents, the flow of electricity. The information that controls everything." Information? Yes. It's not just the power grid. It's the control of information, of systems, of networks. You've only scratched the surface of what's possible. But there's a larger battle going on, and you need to decide which side you're on. Chen stood, walking over to his desk, his mind spinning. A war? A war fought in the currents? He had never thought of it that way. The grid, the machines, the power that flowed through everything, he had always seen it as just technology. Tools. But now, it felt like he was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, a place where the lines between what was real and what was controlled were starting to blur. "Who are these people?" he asked. "What side are they on?" "You'll find out soon enough," the voice said. "But first, you need to understand that you have a choice. You can use this power for your own gain, or you can use it to fight for something bigger. To protect people. To protect the truth. Chen's mind raced. Protect the truth. What did that even mean? Look, the voice continued, you need to meet someone. Someone who can show you how this all works. But you have to trust them. Trust me. You can't do this alone. Chen felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him. It had started out so small, just a curiosity about his own abilities. But now, it was clear that this was no accident. His power wasn't something he could hide from. It wasn't something he could ignore. He was caught in something much bigger than himself, a game he had never signed up for, but one that would determine the fate of everything he had known. He exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Everything in his life, his work, his quiet existence, had been a lie. This was the truth now, whether he was ready for it or not. All right, Chen said, the words leaving his mouth with a quiet resolve. Where do we meet? Good, the voice replied, the tone now tinged with approval. Meet me at the old power plant on the edge of town. I'll be waiting. Chen hung up the phone and sat still for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air like a storm cloud. He had no idea who he was dealing with, but the urgency in the voice, the conviction that he had to make a choice, made it impossible to turn back. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, his mind racing. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. But one thing was clear, whatever had started that night in the substation was only the beginning. He stood up, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. The dim light of his apartment seemed oppressive now, the quiet of the space a stark contrast to the chaos that had begun to unravel around him. His eyes darted to the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly. Somewhere out there, someone was waiting for him. Someone who knew more about his power, someone who could help him understand it, or control it. He didn't know why he was going to the old power plant. It was the last place anyone would go for help, a relic of the past, sitting abandoned on the outskirts of the city. But there was no other option. The person on the phone had been clear, if he didn't show up, he might not get another chance. The drive to the power plant took longer than expected. The roads were slick from the rain that had been falling intermittently throughout the evening, and the headlights of his car cut through the fog in jagged slices. As he approached the outskirts of town, the city's bright lights began to fade behind him, replaced by the gray, looming shapes of industrial buildings and rusting infrastructure. The old power plant was nestled between a forest of decaying towers and tangled wires, a silent monument to a time long gone. Once the heartbeat of the city's energy, it had been abandoned after a series of accidents, mysterious failures that had taken the plant offline for good. Now, it stood as a reminder of what had once been. And yet, tonight, it felt alive, pulsing with some unknown energy that made the hair on the back of Chen's neck stand up. He parked his car at the edge of the plant's broken-down parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The place seemed deserted, but something about the stillness felt wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. As he stepped out of the car, the air hit him with a damp chill. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body and walked toward the entrance of the plant. The rusted gates creaked as he pushed them open, the sound echoing into the night. The tall, silent buildings loomed ahead, windows boarded up, but there was one light glowing faintly from an office on the second floor. Chen's instincts told him to turn back, to find a safer path. But the voice on the phone had said he had no choice. He had to trust them, trust whoever they were. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The inside of the power plant was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs along the ceiling. The smell of oil and decay hung thick in the air, and the floor was covered with dust and debris. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing off the walls. He walked deeper into the plant, his heart pounding as he passed long rows of dormant machines. As he rounded a corner, he froze. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, tall, cloaked in a long coat, and watching him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Chen Peng, the figure said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that suggested this wasn't the first time they had met someone like him. "You made it." Chen's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, the dim light casting his features into sharp relief. He was younger than Chen had expected, probably in his early 30s, with sharp eyes and a face that seemed carved out of stone. His movements were measured, deliberate, like someone accustomed to danger. "I'm someone who can teach you," the man said, his tone calm but unwavering. "But only if you're ready to listen." Chen clenched his fists at his sides, feeling a rush of anger surge up. "Teach me what? About what I can do?" He didn't trust this person, not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had no other choice. "Why should I listen to you?" The man's lips twitched, almost like a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're already in too deep. You've been using your power, haven't you?" Chen's heart skipped. How did he know? "I haven't done anything serious," he said, trying to sound confident, even though doubt gnawed at him. "Just fixing things. Small stuff." The man's eyes darkened. "It's never just small stuff. What you've done isn't just about fixing a broken appliance or turning on a light. You've tapped into something that's much bigger than you. Something that could shift the balance of power in the world." Chen's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" "The grid," the man said, his voice low. "The grid isn't just a network of wires and power stations. It's the backbone of everything, the flow of information, the way the world works. And there are people out there who want to control it. They're using people like you, people who can manipulate the current, to reshape the future." Chen stepped back, his mind spinning. "Who are these people?" The man shrugged, a gesture that didn't seem to answer the question, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he gestured for Chen to follow him deeper into the plant. "I'll show you. But first, you need to understand something." He paused, his voice becoming more intense. "You have a choice. You can continue using your power for yourself, play around, fix things here and there, maybe even get a little thrill. Or you can help us. Help us stop the people who are trying to control the flow of everything." Chen hesitated, uncertainty flooding his chest. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. His mind kept flashing to the mysterious phone call, to the voice that had warned him of the consequences of his actions. "I don't want to be a part of some war," he said finally, his voice strained. "I just want to understand this power. What is it, really?" The man met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "This power is more than you think. It's the ability to control the currents, of electricity, of information, of life itself. People like you, with this ability, are valuable. To the right people, you're a weapon. But to us, you're more than that. You're a chance to change things. To fight back against those who would use this power to control everything." Chen's heart raced. The idea of taking on the powerful forces behind the grid, behind the technology, seemed insane. But the more he listened, the more he realized that he couldn't turn back. There was no going back to his quiet life, no going back to the way things were before the accident. He had stepped into a world where the rules had changed. He nodded slowly. "What do I need to do?" The man smiled, a small, grim smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Follow me, and I'll show you." They moved through the old power plant, deeper into the heart of the machinery. The place seemed to pulse with life, the hum of the electrical systems like the breath of a sleeping giant. But there was something else now, something more. Chen could feel the electricity in the air, the currents flowing beneath his skin, responding to his presence. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was a connection, a deeper understanding of how everything fit together. The man stopped in front of a massive control panel, its lights flickering dimly. "This," he said, "is where the power begins. It's where the grid is controlled, where the flow of information and energy starts. And now, you're part of it." Chen looked at the panel, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that with this power, he could change everything. But the question remained, what would he change it into? Chen stood in front of the massive control panel, his fingers hovering just above the switches and dials. The hum of electricity around him felt heavier now, like the entire plant was alive, watching, waiting. He could feel the pulse of it, the energy coursing through the wires, beckoning him. There was power here, real, raw power, and it was within his reach. The man beside him, the one who had brought him here, stood silent, his eyes trained on the panel as though waiting for Chen to make a decision. Chen's breath was shallow, his pulse quickening as he realized that this was it. This was the moment that everything changed. He had come here seeking answers, seeking control over his own power, but now he was being asked to step into a much larger world, a world of intrigue, danger, and control. "You have to understand," the man said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "This is where it all begins. Not just electricity, not just information, but control over the very systems that govern this world. The grid, the networks, the flow of data, it's all connected. And if you know how to read it, how to move it, you can control everything." Chen looked down at the controls, feeling an undeniable pull to understand it all. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. The power was bigger, more dangerous. And yet, it was exhilarating in a way that made his chest tighten with anticipation. The idea of being able to manipulate the grid, the very lifeblood of the world's infrastructure, was intoxicating, but a doubt crept into his mind. "You keep saying, control," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are we controlling it for?" The man's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said, his eyes flickering to the control panel, then back to Chen. "We're trying to take it back from the people who already control it. People who want to shape the future in their image, people who want to dictate how information flows, how society functions. They use the grid, the information, to manipulate us all." Chen felt the weight of the word settle over him. The idea of manipulation, the quiet hand of those in power steering the currents of life itself, felt like something out of a dystopian novel. He had never thought about the grid this way, had never considered what lay beneath the surface of the systems he worked with every day. But now that he understood, now that he could feel it, it was impossible to ignore. "They can use people like you, Chen," the man continued, his voice steady, but with a hint of something darker lurking beneath the surface. "People who can manipulate the flow of electricity, people who can control the current. And when they do, they control everything. They control governments, corporations, entire economies. They shape history with the flick of a switch." Chen's stomach churned. He had always thought of electricity as just a tool, something to fix, something to manage. But now it was clear, the grid wasn't just about power. It was about influence, about shaping the very foundations of society. The man's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Chen's shoulder. "But you don't have to be one of them. You don't have to be used. You can fight back." Chen looked at him, confusion and anger swirling within him. "And who exactly are we fighting? Who are these people you want me to go up against?" "They're not just people, Chen," the man said quietly. "They're systems. They're the ones who have already shaped this world. The governments, the corporations, the ones who have hijacked the grid and turned it into their own personal weapon. They manipulate data, control communications, influence decisions with the push of a button. They've done it for years, and they're good at it." Chen felt the weight of the man's words sink in. The grid, the world's digital backbone, wasn't just a network of power stations and cables. It was a battlefield, and he was standing on the edge of it, uncertain of which side he should take. The power was his, that much was clear, but how far did he want to go with it? "Do you know who they are?" Chen asked, his voice steady now. Despite the storm of thoughts churning in his mind, the man gave a small nod. "I know who they are. But names don't matter yet. What matters is that you learn how to control the currents, the flow of information. Once you understand how it works, how to read the signals, how to alter them, you'll see. You'll see how deep it all goes. Chen's fingers brushed the switches, and he felt the energy surge beneath his fingertips, like a pulse of life. He could feel the grid connecting to him, responding to him. It was a strange sensation, powerful, dangerous, and somehow comforting. He wanted to understand it. Wanted to know what was possible. What do I need to do? Chen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. You need to understand the flow. You need to learn how to read the current, how to alter it, and how to use it to your advantage. But more than that, you need to learn the enemy's tactics. You need to know how they use the grid to control people. Chen swallowed hard. The words enemy and control rattled around in his mind. But he was here now. He had made his choice. The man stepped aside, revealing a large screen that flickered to life with a simple swipe of his hand. On the screen, lines of code began to scroll rapidly, patterns and sequences that seemed like nothing more than digital noise. But as Chen watched, something shifted. The code wasn't random. It was a language, a code embedded within the grid's framework. He could see it now, how the information moved, how the currents flowed, how the grid was pulsing with data. This is how it works, the man said. This is how the flow is controlled. What you see here, he pointed to the screen, is a map of the grid. Every city, every system, every piece of infrastructure is connected by these currents. And if you know how to read it, you can change anything. You can control the way information flows, the way decisions are made. You can alter the very fabric of reality itself. Chen stared at the screen, the code flashing before his eyes, and for the first time, it clicked. He understood. He understood the power he had. The control, you can manipulate it, the man said, his voice low and knowing. You can change the current. Redirect it. Send it wherever you want. But you need to be careful, because once you alter the flow, you can never go back. The currents will change the world, Chen. They will reshape everything. Chen took a deep breath. The world outside the power plant felt far away, disconnected from the weight of what he was learning. His mind raced with the possibilities, with the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. He had the power to change the course of history. But how far was he willing to go? You need to decide, the man said softly. This is bigger than you. Bigger than me. But it's all in your hands now. Chen looked at the screen again, his fingers twitching, feeling the currents, feeling the power running through the grid. It was all so close, so real. He could reach out and change everything. And for the first time, Chen realized that the future was no longer something that happened to him. It was something he could control. Chen's fingers hovered over the screen, the swirling lines of code reflecting in his eyes, blurring with the overwhelming surge of information coursing through him. It was as if he had suddenly tapped into the heartbeat of the world itself. Every flicker on the monitor, every pulse of data, seemed to resonate deep within his chest. The hum of electricity, the flow of information, the sheer interconnectedness, it all felt like a web that was just waiting for him to pluck the right string. That he could feel it now, the potential, the raw, untamed power. All he had to do was reach out and alter the current. Change the flow of data, redirect it, control it. The thought made his head spin with possibilities, but as much as the temptation called to him, a part of him hesitated. There was so much at stake. This wasn't just about fixing a broken appliance or shifting traffic lights anymore. This was bigger. This was about controlling everything. That he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The man next to him, watching him closely, seemed to sense his hesitation. You're thinking about it too much, the man said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. You don't need to understand all of it right now. You don't need to know every detail. Just feel it. Let it flow through you. Once you do, it'll be like second nature. Chen nodded slowly, trying to focus. He reached forward, his fingers making contact with the screen. The moment they did, something inside him clicked. It was as if the grid recognized him, welcomed him. The hum in the air grew louder, a vibration that seemed to match the beating of his heart. The currents moved beneath his skin, responding to his will. He could feel it, the way the system pulsed with life, the way the code bent to his thoughts. The data, once chaotic and disjointed, now appeared in clear patterns. He could see the way it all connected, the way the flow of electricity mirrored the flow of information. It wasn't just about manipulating power, it was about rewriting the very structure of the world. Good, the man said, his voice filled with approval. You're starting to get it. Chen's mind raced as he scanned the data on the screen. He was no longer just a passive observer, he was part of the system now, an active participant in the flow of energy. He could feel it, the current, wrapping around him like an invisible force. It was intoxicating. What happens next? Chen asked, his voice hoarse as he tried to grasp the enormity of what was unfolding before him. The man looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Now, we start small. Just a few changes, a few tweaks. The grid, the flow, it can be a delicate thing. If you pull too hard, too fast, it could break. But with practice, you'll learn how to control it. Chen's fingers twitched over the controls again. He was ready. He could feel the power building inside him, just waiting to be released. The screen in front of him flickered, lines of code rearranging themselves as he focused. He could sense the flow of energy, the currents moving like rivers, branching out into every part of the city. He could redirect them, change their course. The moment he made contact, the lights in the room flickered, and the hum of the machinery shifted. Chen's heart skipped a beat. It worked. He had done it. He had altered the flow, manipulated the current. The power was in his hands, and it felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. He pulled his hand back, staring at the screen, his pulse racing. That's it? It's that simple? The man's lips curled into a faint smile. It's simple when you know how to read it. But this is just the beginning. What you're doing now, it's like a child learning to walk. There's so much more you can do with this power. But the key is control. You have to understand the consequences of every move you make. Chen nodded, trying to process everything. Control. Consequences. He had already felt the thrill of it, the rush of bending the current to his will. But now, as he took in the man's words, he realized how much more there was to consider. This wasn't just about playing with power. This was about making choices that could change the world. What happens when I can control it all? Chen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens when I have the power to change everything? The man's gaze grew colder, more intense. You have to ask yourself if that's what you really want. To change everything? Because once you start, you don't get to go back. You'll be changing the course of history, whether you like it or not. And once you have control, you'll have enemies. People who will stop at nothing to take it from you. Chen swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The power to control the grid, to rewrite the flow of data, it was a weapon, a tool that could change everything. But at what cost? The man turned, walking toward the far side of the room. There's a reason we're here, Chen, he said over his shoulder. A reason we're doing this. The people who control the grid, the ones who have hijacked it, they're using it for their own gain. They're manipulating the world. The way we live, the way we think, the way we act, they control all of it through information, through the currents. And now, we can do something about it. Chen looked at the screen again, watching the lines of code flicker and shift. He could feel the pulse of it, the raw power that surged through the grid. It was all so close. He could almost reach out and change it, reshape the world in his image. But the question remained, should he? You don't have to make a decision now, the man said, as though reading his thoughts. But the time will come. The time when you'll have to choose. And when that time comes, you'll need to ask yourself what kind of world you want to live in. The one where they control everything? Or the one where you do? Chen didn't respond. Instead, he reached out again, his fingers brushing the screen. This time, it was different. The power surged through him, more intense than before, as though the current was responding to his thoughts, to his will. He could feel it, the connections, the way the flow of information shifted and adapted. He could change anything. But the thought of the consequences lingered in the back of his mind that he pulled his hand back again, uncertain. The weight of the decision was pressing on him. The man had given him a glimpse into the power that lay at his fingertips, but it wasn't just about control. It was about responsibility. The responsibility to wield that power wisely. Because once the currents were changed, they could never be the same again. You'll understand soon enough, the man said, his voice softening. When you see the truth, when you realize what's really at stake, you'll know what to do. Chen looked up, his gaze meeting the man's. He could feel the weight of the decision settling in his chest. This wasn't just about power. It was about the future. His future. The future of the world, and it was up to him to decide which path to take. The man's words hung in the air, a weighty silence settling between them. Chen's mind raced, torn between the exhilarating possibilities of power and the gnawing fear of what it might cost him. He could feel it, the current, the control, just within his grasp. The choice was his, and for the first time, the direction of the future seemed to rest entirely on his shoulders. But there was something about the weight of that decision that made him hesitate, something in the pit of his stomach that warned him not to rush forward blindly. What kind of person would he become if he followed this path? Was he truly ready for the consequences of altering the flow of the world? Could he handle the responsibility of the control he now possessed? The man watched him closely, sensing the tension in the air. He seemed to understand the conflict within Chen, but didn't rush to fill the silence. His patience was unnerving, as though he knew it was only a matter of time before Chen would make his decision. Chen exhaled slowly, trying to calm his thoughts. "What happens if I change everything?" he asked, his voice steady but betraying a trace of uncertainty. "What happens when I'm the one in control?" The man's gaze darkened, his expression hardening. "You've already seen what can be done with a small shift in the flow. Imagine what would happen if you controlled it all. The power to redirect information, to create or destroy, reshape economies, governments, entire societies. You'd hold the world in the palm of your hand. Is that really what you want me to do?" Chen asked, his heart thudding in his chest. "Control everything?" The man didn't respond immediately. He simply turned, walking to a nearby terminal and pulling up another stream of data on the screen. The light flickered above them as Chen watched the numbers scroll across the screen like a living organism, always moving, always shifting. The man pointed to a series of lines and clusters of information, barely visible to someone without his knowledge. "This is the network," he said, his finger tracing the connections. "This is the heartbeat of the world. Every piece of data, every communication, every transaction, every movement is connected through these currents. You've tapped into it, Chen. You can feel it now. You've already changed things, just by interacting with it." Chen stared at the data, his mind working overtime as he began to understand just how vast the web was. The flow of information wasn't just limited to what he could see in front of him. It was everywhere, beneath the surface, in the cables and satellites, in the digital air itself. And it was all interconnected, all dependent on the grid. But there was a dark side to it too. A side that manipulated, controlled, twisted everything in its path. "Is this why you brought me here?" Chen asked, his voice quieter now, filled with a mixture of awe and dread. "To give me power over all of this?" The man met his gaze. "Not just power. Knowledge. We're not here to create another tool of oppression. What we're building is something else entirely, a resistance, a way to stop the people who've hijacked the currents and used them to control us. Chen's mind swirled with the complexity of it all. On one hand, the idea of using his power to free the world from the invisible hands that controlled it was compelling. On the other hand, he knew that even with the best of intentions, such power could easily corrupt. The lines between good and evil weren't always clear, and no one could hold this much control without consequences. What if I fail? He asked, almost to himself, as he watched the glowing data on the screen. What if I lose control? The man didn't flinch, his expression calm. That's why we need to be careful. You're not alone in this, Chen. We've built a network of people who understand what's at stake. But we need you. Your ability to feel the current, to read it, to manipulate it, it's unique. There's no one else like you. Chen's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of his role settled around him. He had a choice. He could walk away, leave this dangerous world of power and control behind and return to his old life, to the comforting hum of his quiet existence. Or he could stay, step into the shadows of this hidden war, and fight for a future where he controlled the flow of the world. I'm not sure I can do this, Chen said, his voice breaking through the quiet of the room. The man turned toward him, his eyes dark but filled with understanding. You can. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything right now. But you do have to decide. Are you going to fight for control of the current, or are you going to let others use it to control you? The silence stretched out between them. Chen looked at the screen again, the endless stream of data that represented the lifeblood of the world. The power to change it was at his fingertips, and with it, the power to change the world. But as his fingers hovered over the screen, Chen couldn't shake the thought that if he truly controlled the flow, he would never be free of it. He would be a part of the current, bound to its unyielding pull. There was no turning back. I don't know what to do, he said quietly, the uncertainty in his voice clear. The man stepped forward, his presence filling the room. You don't need to know everything right now. What matters is that you understand one thing: this power, this ability, it's not about control. It's about freedom. The current is a force that flows through everything. It doesn't belong to anyone. But the people who control it? They've built their empire on manipulating that flow. They've used it to control what we think, what we believe, even what we fear. And they're not going to stop unless someone fights back. Chen looked at the man, the weight of his words sinking in. And you want me to fight for freedom? The man nodded. Yes. But first, you need to understand what's really at stake. The grid is just a reflection of the world. What you do to the current, how you manipulate the data, the power, it will have consequences. You have to be willing to face them. Because once you begin this fight, you can't back down. Chen's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He felt a strange sense of clarity, like he had stumbled into a larger truth that had been waiting for him. He had power, real power. And he could use it, not just to change his life, but to change the world. For the first time, he understood that it wasn't just about him. The future of everything, of society, of the world itself, was in the balance. And he had a role to play in it. I'll do it, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. I'll fight. The man's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Good. Because the world needs you. And I think you're ready. Chen took one last look at the screen, the currents of power moving in intricate patterns, and knew that his life had changed forever. There was no going back now. The fight for control had only just begun.